Introduction: the moment the system reorganizes. There is a point in every human life where effort stops being enough. Not because effort has no value, but because it is being applied to the wrong level of reality. Most people try to change their lives from the surface. They try more action, more discipline, more motivation, and more information. But the structure underneath remains unchanged. And because the structure remains the same, the results repeat. Again and again. Until something deeper is recognized. The shift in understanding. At some point, the question changes. It is no longer, how do I fix my life? It becomes, what system is my life responding to? Because experience is not random. It is structured. There are layers operating at all times. There is conscious awareness, which is what you think you are choosing. There is subconscious programming, which is what you repeat automatically. And there is a deeper organizing intelligence that responds to alignment and coherence. Most people live at the surface layer. But the deeper layers are what shape the outcome. Reality as a response. The most important realization is this. Reality is not something happening to you. It is something responding through you. Your thoughts are not isolated. Your emotions are not random. Your behaviors are not separate from your identity. They are signals. And those signals organize your experience. Your financial life reflects those signals. Your physical health reflects those signals. Your daily patterns reflect those signals. Not as reward or punishment, but as consistency. The turning point. The shift does not come from doing more. It comes from seeing more clearly. Instead of trying to force outcomes, you begin to observe the internal structure producing them. And once you see the structure, something changes. Because what was once automatic becomes visible. And what becomes visible can be directed. If you are hearing this, you are already within the process. This is not information to pass through. This is something to engage with. As you move through this work, do not simply listen. Observe yourself. Notice your thoughts. Notice your reactions. Notice the patterns that repeat in your life. And ask yourself one question consistently. Is this how I am currently operating? Not who you want to be, but what is actually being expressed through your system. If this work is creating clarity for you, stay connected to it. Follow this process so you continue moving forward. Subscribe so you remain aligned with the next layers of understanding. And comment what is becoming clear to you. Because what you bring into awareness becomes something you can begin to change. Chapter 1: The Original Program. Before anything in your life ever looked the way it does now, it was already being shaped. Not by chance. Not by random events. But by a system running beneath awareness. A system you did not consciously choose. The foundation of the program. Most people believe their life is built from decisions. But decisions are not the root. They are the result of something deeper. They are influenced by repeated experiences, emotional conditioning, and early identity formation. By the time you begin trying to change your life consciously, the system has already been running for years. Quietly and consistently. Survival as the baseline. At the core of this system is survival. Not expansion. Not abundance. Survival. The subconscious mind is designed to maintain what is familiar. It does not prioritize what is best. It prioritizes what is known. So even when a pattern is limiting, it is maintained if it feels familiar. Identity shapes everything. Before outcomes exist, identity exists. You develop internal definitions about who you are and what is possible for you. These definitions are not chosen at first. They are absorbed through repetition and experience. Once identity stabilizes, it becomes the blueprint for everything that follows. Your thoughts align with it. Your actions reflect it. Your results reinforce it. Why effort did not work? At some point, you likely tried to change your life through effort. You may have worked harder, learned more, or tried to stay motivated. But the deeper patterns remained. This is because effort operates at the surface level. The system that produces results operates beneath it. So without changing the underlying structure, effort alone cannot create lasting change. The loop of experience. The system operates in a loop. Identity shapes perception. Perception shapes behavior. Behavior creates results. Results reinforce identity. This loop continues automatically, and it maintains consistency in your experience. The first real shift. The beginning of change is not action. It is recognition. You begin to see that your life has been shaped by a program. Not consciously, but consistently. And once you see the program, you can begin to work with it. Not by force, but by understanding how it operates. Transition. If your life has been shaped by a system you did not consciously design, then the next question becomes clear. What happens when you begin to change the identity at the center of that system? Because when identity changes, everything connected to it begins to reorganize. And that is where the next stage begins. Chapter 2: The Identity Shift That Rewires the System. At a deeper level than thought, and deeper than belief, you are operating as a bioprogrammed consciousness system. This system is not symbolic. It is biological, neurological, and perceptual all at once. In simple terms, your identity is not just an idea you hold about yourself. It is the operating frequency your entire system runs on. The body is the executing system. The body does not respond to words, affirmations, or intentions alone. It responds to what it has learned to recognize as truth through repetition and emotional encoding. Every identity you have ever held is stored as patterns in the nervous system. These patterns shape hormonal responses, breath rhythm, muscle tension, digestion, heart rate variability, and even attention span. This means identity is not abstract. Identity is physical instruction expressed through biology. The subconscious is a stability engine. The subconscious mind is not emotional or philosophical. It is a stability system. Its only directive is this: maintain what is familiar. Not what is best. Not what is desired. Only what is familiar. This is why the system resists change, even when change is beneficial. Because unfamiliar states are interpreted as instability. So the body does not ask, is this better? It asks, is this known? Why change creates internal resistance? When identity begins to shift consciously, the nervous system responds before thought completes itself. This creates sensations such as internal tension, emotional discomfort, mental resistance, fatigue, or a pull back toward old behaviors. This is not failure. This is the body attempting to preserve the previous identity configuration. In simple terms, the system is rejecting mismatch between the old identity and the emerging one. Identity is a signal, not a story. At the core level, identity is not a narrative. It is a continuous biological signal being broadcast through the nervous system. And reality does not respond to the story you tell about yourself. It responds to the signal your system consistently emits. When the signal changes, perception begins to reorganize. Attention changes. Behavior changes. Interpretation changes. External experience follows. Not instantly, but structurally. The initiation shift from becoming to being. At this stage, something fundamental begins to collapse. The idea that you are becoming something new. That framework implies distance and delay. Instead, what becomes clear is this. You are either stabilizing the old identity signal or stabilizing a new one. There is no neutral state. There is only interference or coherence. Interference produces repetition of old patterns. Coherence produces reorganization of experience. The superconscious correction layer. Beyond subconscious programming is a deeper organizing intelligence. This is not external. It is emergent pattern intelligence that arises when internal systems become coherent. In practical terms, when your internal state stabilizes, your external environment begins to align through timing, opportunity, and decision clarity. When internal systems are fragmented, external experience appears delayed, chaotic, or misaligned. This is not reward or punishment. It is feedback from a self-organizing system responding to signal stability. Why money and health reflect this system? Wealth and health are not separate from this process. They are expressions of system coherence in material form. When the internal system is fragmented, financial and physical systems reflect instability. When the internal system is coherent, both wealth flow and bodily regulation begin to stabilize. In simple terms, your financial reality and physical state are downstream effects of identity coherence. Signal stability is the real practice. Transformation is not created through intensity or temporary motivation. It is created through signal stability over time. Most people shift briefly, then return to old patterns because the nervous system has not been trained to hold the new identity configuration under pressure, uncertainty, or lack of external validation. The real work is this. Noticing old identity activation. Interrupting automatic physiological response. Returning to the chosen internal signal. And sustaining it consistently across time. This is where transformation becomes real. Not in thought, but in biological reconditioning. Final realization. You are not learning how to think differently. You are training your entire system to remain coherent under a new identity state. When coherence stabilizes, perception expands, decisions become clearer, opportunity recognition increases, and behavior aligns without force. Reality does not respond to desire. It responds to sustained internal order. Transition. Once identity is understood as a biological signal system rather than a mental concept, the next layer becomes attention itself. Because attention is what determines which version of reality the system locks onto in real time. And that is where the next stage begins. Chapter 3: Subconscious Rewriting for Wealth and Vitality. At this stage of understanding, something becomes very clear. Your life is not being shaped primarily by effort. It is being shaped by repetition inside the subconscious system. In simple terms, what you repeatedly feel, expect, and internally rehearse becomes the structure your external reality organizes around. This includes both wealth and health. The subconscious does not respond to logic. The subconscious mind does not evaluate ideas based on truth or accuracy. It evaluates based on repetition, emotional intensity, and survival familiarity. This means even when you consciously understand something new, your deeper system may still be running an older instruction set. So you can intellectually know abundance is possible, while still emotionally and physically operating from scarcity conditioning. Why financial patterns feel stuck. When it comes to wealth, most limitations are not external. They are internal repetition loops. These loops often sound like subtle internal patterns such as, "This is how much I can safely have. This is how money comes and goes for me. I have to manage just enough to stay stable." These are not conscious decisions. They are subconscious financial identity scripts, and they repeat automatically until rewritten at the root level. The body is part of the wealth system. Wealth is not only mental or external. It is also physiological. When the body is in chronic stress or contraction, it signals limitation. When the body is in regulation and openness, it signals expansion. In simple terms, the nervous system either supports flow or restricts it. This is why financial behavior often changes when internal emotional states change. Because the body and mind are part of the same system. Health and wealth follow the same mechanism. Health patterns operate through the same structure. The body learns expectations. It learns what level of energy, vitality, and regulation is normal. If stress, fatigue, or imbalance has been repeated for long periods, the system begins to treat that state as baseline. And anything outside of that baseline feels unfamiliar. So just like wealth, health is also stabilized through repetition of internal states. The rewriting process is not intellectual. Subconscious rewriting does not happen through analysis alone. It happens through repeated internal experience. This includes focused attention on new identity states, emotional rehearsal of new outcomes, consistent internal dialogue aligned with desired reality, and behavioral reinforcement in small daily decisions. The key is not intensity. The key is consistency. Because repetition is what stabilizes identity at the subconscious level. Interruption is the first step. Before new programming can take hold, old programming must be interrupted. This happens in real time. When an old thought pattern arises, it is not something to judge or resist. It is something to observe, and then consciously redirect. Not by force, but by recognition and replacement. Over time, this interruption weakens the automatic loop. The new internal rehearsal. Once interruption becomes stable, the next phase begins. This is internal rehearsal. This means consciously experiencing the version of reality you are moving toward. Not as fantasy, but as neurological training. Because the subconscious cannot distinguish fully between real experience and vividly repeated internal experience. So what you consistently rehearse begins to feel familiar. And what feels familiar begins to become default. Why this creates real-world change. As subconscious patterns shift, behavior naturally follows. You begin to make different financial decisions without forcing them. You begin to move differently in opportunities. You begin to feel different about receiving, spending, and holding wealth. The same applies to health. Choices begin to align with regulation rather than depletion. Not because you are forcing discipline, but because the internal system has changed its baseline. The real objective. The objective of subconscious rewriting is not to think positive. It is to stabilize a new internal operating system. One where wealth and health are not desired outcomes, but natural expressions of internal coherence. Transition. Once subconscious programming begins to shift through repetition and internal rehearsal, something deeper becomes available. Attention itself begins to reorganize. And attention is what determines what reality structure the system locks onto in real time. That is where the next layer begins. Chapter 4: Attention as the Primary Creative Force. At this stage of understanding, something becomes undeniable. You are not passively experiencing reality. You are continuously selecting it. Not through effort, but through attention. Attention is not passive. Attention is often mistaken as something you simply use to focus. But attention is not passive awareness. Attention is an active organizing force. It determines what information becomes important, what patterns become visible, and what possibilities become real enough for action. In simple terms, whatever receives your consistent attention becomes structurally amplified in your experience. Why attention creates your personal reality. Your mind is exposed to far more information than you can consciously process. So the system filters reality based on what it has been trained to recognize as relevant. This filtering is not random. It is shaped by identity and subconscious conditioning. This means what you repeatedly attend to becomes what your system assumes is important. And what your system assumes is important becomes what it organizes your life around. Attention and wealth. In financial reality, attention determines structure. If attention is consistently directed toward lack, limitation, or uncertainty, the system organizes perception around those signals. Opportunities are still present, but they are filtered out as irrelevant or unsafe. If attention is directed toward expansion, solutions, and possibility, the system begins to recognize patterns that support movement and growth. In simple terms, attention does not create money directly. It determines what you are able to perceive, and perception determines what actions become available. Attention and health. The same mechanism applies to the body. When attention is repeatedly focused on stress, symptoms, or fear-based interpretation of bodily sensation, the nervous system amplifies those signals. The body learns to organize itself around vigilance. When attention is placed on regulation, recovery, and stability, the nervous system begins to shift into restoration patterns. This is not mindset alone. This is physiological reorganization through sustained focus. The mechanism of filtering. Your attention acts as a selection system. It does not just observe reality. It decides what becomes foreground and what remains background. Over time, whatever is placed in the foreground repeatedly becomes your perceived normal. And what becomes normal becomes identity confirming. This is how attention slowly constructs your lived reality. Why most people lose control of attention. Most attention is not consciously directed. It is captured. By habit. By emotion. By environment. By repetition. By external stimulation. This means much of what people call reality is actually reactive attention cycling through familiar patterns. Without awareness, attention is constantly being redirected back to old identity structures. The practice of attention discipline. Regaining control begins with recognition. You begin to notice where your attention goes without intention. Then you begin to gently interrupt automatic absorption. Not through force, but through redirection. You place attention back onto chosen internal states, chosen interpretations, and chosen possibilities. At first, this feels unstable. But over time, attention becomes trainable. And what is trainable becomes powerful. Attention is the link between inner and outer reality. Subconscious programming shapes perception. Identity shapes interpretation. But attention is the bridge that determines what actually gets stabilized in awareness. It is the point where internal state becomes external experience. This is why attention is the most direct tool of reality interaction. Not because it creates everything instantly, but because it selects what becomes structurally reinforced over time. The deeper realization. You are not trying to change reality through effort. You are learning how to stop unconsciously selecting the same patterns repeatedly. Once attention becomes stable and intentional, perception begins to widen. And when perception widens, opportunities, insights, and pathways begin to appear that were always present but previously filtered out. Transition. When attention becomes stabilized, something even more subtle begins to emerge. There is a deeper layer of intelligence that begins to organize timing, decisions, and alignment without conscious effort. This is where superconscious pattern recognition begins to reveal itself. And that is where we go next. Chapter 5: Emotional Frequency and Biological Reality. At this stage, something deeper begins to reveal itself. Thought alone is not what shapes your reality. Emotion is what stabilizes it. Not emotion as a reaction to life, but emotion as a sustained internal condition that the body learns to recognize as normal. Emotion is a biological signal. Emotion is not just a feeling. It is a chemical and neurological signal that instructs the body how to operate. Every emotional state produces a pattern in the nervous system. It affects hormone release, muscle tension, heart rhythm, and brain activity. In simple terms, emotion tells the body what kind of reality it is living in. The body learns through repetition of feeling. The subconscious mind does not learn through logic. It learns through repeated emotional experience. If stress is repeated, the body adapts to stress. If pressure is repeated, the body stabilizes around pressure. If calm and certainty are repeated, the body begins to accept those states as normal. This means your emotional patterns are not temporary. They are training your biological system. Why wealth is tied to emotional states. Your financial life is not separate from your emotional conditioning. If money is consistently associated with urgency, fear, or instability, the nervous system treats financial activity as a threat. This leads to contraction, hesitation, and reactive decision-making. If money becomes associated with stability, clarity, and openness, the system begins to respond differently. Decisions become cleaner. Timing improves. Opportunities are recognized without force. In simple terms, your emotional baseline determines how your system interacts with money. Health is regulated the same way. The body does not separate emotion from physical function. Chronic emotional stress signals the body to remain in survival mode. This affects digestion, immune response, energy production, and recovery. When emotional states shift toward regulation, the body begins to repair itself more efficiently. This is not separate from consciousness. It is the physical expression of it. The emotional identity loop. Emotion and identity reinforce each other continuously. If identity is based in limitation, emotional states will reflect contraction and instability. If identity begins to shift, emotional states begin to follow. This creates a loop. And whichever pattern is repeated becomes stronger over time. Why new states feel unnatural? When you introduce a new internal state, the body may resist it. It may feel unfamiliar or unstable. There may be subtle discomfort or a pull back to old emotional patterns. This is not a sign that the new state is incorrect. It is a sign that the body has not yet learned to maintain it. In simple terms, the system is still trained in the old baseline. Emotional stabilization as practice. The work is not to force emotion. It is to guide and stabilize it. You begin by noticing your current emotional state without reacting to it. Then you introduce a new state intentionally. This may be calm, certainty, openness, or grounded confidence. You do not force intensity. You allow repetition. Over time, the body begins to recognize the new state as safe. And what is safe becomes sustainable. Emotion as a creative force. Emotion is what signals the subconscious to accept or reject change. If a new identity is paired with a stable emotional state, it becomes easier for the system to adopt it. If the emotional state contradicts the identity, the system returns to the old pattern. This is why emotional coherence is necessary for transformation. The deeper realization. You are not trying to eliminate emotion. You are learning how to stabilize emotional patterns that support expansion instead of contraction. When emotional states become regulated, the body, mind, and perception begin to align. And when alignment stabilizes, external experience begins to reflect that internal order. Transition. Once emotional states become stable, another layer begins to open. Decisions become clearer. Timing improves. And action begins to feel less forced. This is where a deeper level of intelligence begins to operate through you. And that is where we go next. Chapter 6: Superconscious Intelligence and Aligned Action. At this stage, the system begins to change in a way that feels subtle at first, then undeniable. Because once identity, attention, and emotional states begin to stabilize, a different kind of intelligence starts to operate through you. Not above you, not outside you, but through you. What the superconscious actually is. The superconscious is not mystical in the way it is often described. It is a higher-order pattern recognition system. It processes more information than conscious thought can handle. It recognizes timing, alignment, and sequence without needing step-by-step logic. In simple terms, it is the part of you that sees patterns before you can explain them. How it begins to activate. This layer does not activate through force. It activates through coherence. When your internal system becomes stable, the noise reduces. And when the noise reduces, subtle signals become easier to detect. These signals appear as a quiet knowing, a clear sense of direction, a pull toward certain actions, or a recognition of opportunity without overthinking. This is not guessing. This is pattern recognition becoming conscious. The difference between intuition and impulse. At this level, it becomes important to distinguish between two things. Impulse is reactive and often tied to old conditioning. It feels urgent, pressured, or emotionally charged. Intuition is different. It is calm, direct, and clear. It does not argue. It does not rush. It presents itself and remains available. In simple terms, intuition feels stable, while impulse feels reactive. Decision-making begins to change. When this system becomes active, decisions begin to feel different. You no longer rely only on analysis. You begin to recognize what aligns before you can fully explain why. This leads to cleaner decisions, faster movement, less second-guessing, and more consistent follow-through. This is not randomness. It is internal alignment guiding action. Wealth through alignment. In financial reality, this becomes very noticeable. You begin to recognize opportunities that previously would have been ignored. You begin to act on ideas without over-delaying. You begin to move in ways that create momentum. Not because you are forcing results, but because your system is aligned with what you are doing. In simple terms, action becomes more efficient. Less wasted movement. More direct outcomes. Health through alignment. The same applies to the body. You begin to sense what supports your system and what does not. You begin to make decisions that improve energy, recovery, and stability. Not through strict control, but through clear internal signals. The body becomes easier to work with, because you are no longer ignoring its communication, trusting the signal. This stage requires a different kind of discipline. Not control, but trust. You begin to act on clear signals without needing constant external validation. At first, this may feel unfamiliar, because you are used to relying on external confirmation. But over time, internal clarity becomes enough. The role of action. This is where many people hesitate. They feel the signal, but delay the action. And when action is delayed, alignment weakens. In simple terms, recognition without movement breaks the cycle. So the practice becomes simple. When clarity appears, act on it. Not recklessly, but without unnecessary delay. The system begins to synchronize. As this process continues, something begins to happen. Experiences start to align. Timing improves. Opportunities appear closer together. Effort begins to feel more effective. This is not coincidence. It is synchronization between internal state and external experience. The deeper realization. You are not trying to control every outcome. You are aligning your system so that the right actions become obvious and natural. When alignment is present, action becomes clear. And when action is clear, results begin to follow with less resistance. Transition. Once action, intuition, and internal alignment begin to work together, the final layer becomes available. This is where identity, attention, emotion, and action are no longer separate processes. They become one continuous state of being. And that is where we go next. Chapter 7, Full Embodiment and System Stabilization. At this stage, something changes in a way that is no longer temporary. The work is no longer something you are doing. It becomes something you are. Not as an idea, but as a stabilized internal condition. From practice to default state. In the earlier stages, everything required attention. You had to notice patterns, redirect thought, regulate emotion, and act with awareness. Now, the system begins to hold itself. The new identity is no longer something you return to. It becomes where you operate from automatically. In simple terms, what once required effort now feels natural. The nervous system has adapted. This shift happens because the body has been retrained. The nervous system no longer treats expansion as unfamiliar. It no longer reacts to stability as something temporary. It begins to recognize coherence as normal. This means you can hold clarity, calm, and direction without forcing it. And that changes everything. Wealth as a stabilized pattern. At this level, financial experience begins to feel different. You are no longer reacting to money. You are interacting with it from a stable internal position. Decisions become consistent. Receiving becomes more natural. Holding and growing wealth feels less stressful. In simple terms, money stops feeling unpredictable. It begins to reflect your internal order. Health as a baseline state. The same shift occurs in the body. Energy becomes more stable. Recovery becomes more efficient. The body responds faster to regulation. You are no longer constantly correcting imbalance. You are maintaining stability. This does not mean perfection. It means resilience. Collapse of internal conflict. One of the most important changes at this stage is the reduction of internal conflict. There is less back and forth between opposing thoughts. Less emotional contradiction. Less hesitation between knowing and acting. The system becomes unified. And when the system is unified, movement becomes direct. Consistency without force. Discipline changes form at this level. It is no longer something you push yourself into. It becomes a natural expression of your internal state. You do what aligns because it feels correct, not because you are forcing yourself to stay on track. In simple terms, consistency becomes automatic. External reality begins to match. As internal stability holds, external patterns begin to reflect it more clearly. Opportunities remain consistent. Progress becomes more predictable. Setbacks have less impact. Because the internal system no longer collapses under pressure. This is where results begin to feel sustainable. The importance of maintenance. Even at this level, awareness remains important. Not because you are unstable, but because awareness maintains clarity. Small shifts can still occur. Old patterns can still appear briefly, but they no longer take control. They are noticed, and they pass. The state of being. At this point, identity, attention, emotion, and action are no longer separate processes. They function together as one system. You are not switching between techniques. You are operating from a unified state. This is what creates continuity. And continuity is what creates long-term results. The final realization. You are not maintaining a practice anymore. You are maintaining a state of being. And from that state, wealth and health are no longer distant outcomes. They are natural expressions of how your system operates. Transition. With the system stabilized, only one layer remains. Not how to create. Not how to align. But how to live from this level consistently and intentionally over time. And that is where we complete this process. Chapter 8. Sovereign Integration and Continuous Creation. At this final stage, the process is no longer something you are learning. It is something you are living. Not occasionally. Not when conditions are right. But as a continuous way of operating within reality. From practice to sovereignty. Everything you have moved through has led to this point. You are no longer reacting to identity. You are no longer chasing alignment. You are no longer trying to stabilize your state. You are now aware of the system as it operates. And because you are aware of it, you can move within it intentionally. In simple terms, you are no longer inside the program unconsciously. You are interacting with it consciously. Reality as a responsive system. Reality begins to feel different at this level. Not distant. Not random. Not unpredictable. But responsive. You begin to see clearly that what you stabilize internally becomes what you experience externally. Not instantly, but consistently. And because you understand the structure, you are no longer waiting for change. You are directing it. The continuous cycle of creation. Creation does not stop once results appear. It continues. Identity influences attention. Attention shapes perception. Perception drives action. Action produces experience. An experience reinforces identity. This cycle does not end. But now it is no longer automatic. It is directed. Wealth as a flow state. At this level, wealth is no longer something you try to acquire. It becomes something you allow, direct, and expand. You recognize patterns sooner. You act with more clarity. You hold stability even when variables change. Money begins to feel less like something you chase, and more like something that moves through a system that is already open. Health as intelligent balance. The body reflects the same shift. You respond to signals earlier. You maintain regulation more consistently. You recover more efficiently. health becomes less about correction and more about maintenance of balance. In simple terms, the body becomes cooperative instead of reactive, living without reversion. One of the final shifts is this. You no longer fully return to the old state. Old thoughts may appear. Old emotions may surface briefly. But they no longer anchor. They pass through a system that is now stable. This is not perfection. This is mastery of direction. The responsibility of awareness. With awareness comes responsibility, not pressure, but clarity. You begin to see how small shifts in attention, emotion, or action influence larger outcomes over time. This makes you more precise, more intentional, more aware of how you are shaping your experience. The state of continuous creation. At this level, there is no separation between you and the process. You are not using techniques. You are living in alignment with the system itself. And because of that, creation becomes continuous. Not forced. Not rushed. But consistent. Final realization. You were never separate from the system you are learning to use. You were always within it. The difference now is awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because once you see clearly, you cannot fully return to unconscious operation. And from that point forward, your life becomes something you participate in deliberately. If you have moved through this work with attention, then something within you has already begun to shift. Not because you tried harder, but because you started to see more clearly. Now the question becomes simple. Will you apply what you have recognized? Continue the process. Do not allow this to remain information. Return to these chapters. Listen again. Observe yourself in real time. Notice where your identity activates. Notice where your attention goes. Notice how your emotional states stabilize or shift. This is where the real work continues. Stay connected to the work. If this has expanded your awareness in any way, remain connected to this process. Follow this work so you can continue building on what has been started. Subscribe so you stay aligned with deeper levels of understanding and application. And comment what has become clear to you, not as opinion, but as recognition. Because what you articulate becomes conscious. And what becomes conscious becomes something you can direct. Final word. This is not the end of a process. It is the beginning of a different way of living. One where you are no longer reacting to reality unconsciously, but participating in it with awareness. And from that place, wealth, health, and experience itself begin to move differently. Because now you do.